The massive crystal chamber of the Galactic Council hummed with tension. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat motionless at the human delegation table, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic display showing casualty reports from the Kepler colony massacre. Around her, representatives from 47 different species shifted nervously in their specialized seating arrangements. The air recycling systems worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric requirements, creating a subtle but constant background noise that seemed to amplify the growing unease in the room. Sarah could feel hundreds of alien eyes watching her, waiting for her response to the hegemony's latest proposal. "The terms are more than generous," declared Overlord Vex-High, his towering insectoid frame clicking with agitation. The Zephyrian's mandibles spread wide in what passed for a diplomatic smile among his species. "Humanity will retain full autonomy over 17 systems. The Outer Rim territories will remain under joint administration. In exchange, you merely acknowledge hegemony sovereignty over the disputed regions." Sarah's fingers drummed once against the polished metal of the table. Just once. But every diplomat in the chamber caught the gesture. They had learned to read human body language over the past 6 months of negotiations. That single drumming motion meant the same thing it had meant every time before. No. "Ambassador Chen," pressed Counselor Thane, the elderly Altarian whose blue-scaled face showed genuine concern. "Please reconsider. The hegemony controls 70% of known space. They have offered terms that allow your species to maintain independence. This is unprecedented generosity." Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. 73%, actually, and growing every day. She stood slowly, her modest height dwarfed by most of the alien representatives around her. "But you're missing something important in your calculations, Counselor." The holographic display shifted at her gesture, showing detailed star charts of human territory. Red markers indicated military installations, green showed civilian colonies, and blue marked research stations. The pattern was chaotic compared to the neat, orderly territories claimed by other species. "The hegemony's proposal requires us to abandon 12 worlds," Sarah continued. "Not 17 systems under our control. 12 worlds with human civilians. 3 billion people who would become subjects of the hegemony." Vex-High's mandibles clicked irritably. "They would be relocated to approved territories. The hegemony has excellent citizen relocation programs." "How many species have you relocated, Overlord?" Sarah asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every representative in the chamber knew the answer. The Zephyrian hegemony had relocated populations from 41 conquered worlds over the past 3 centuries. None of those populations existed as distinct cultures anymore. "The process ensures optimal resource utilization and social harmony," Vex-High replied. "Your people would benefit from proper integration into our administrative systems." Sarah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Integration. Is that what happened to the Corvani? Or the Heshatar Collective? Because I've read your integration reports, Overlord. Very thorough documentation of how you dissolve entire civilizations." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. The fate of absorbed populations was rarely discussed so directly in council sessions. Counselor Thane raised a weathered hand. "Ambassador, surely you understand the pragmatic realities. The hegemony's expansion is inevitable. They offer terms now, but refusal means eventual conquest anyway. Why sacrifice billions of human lives for symbolic resistance?" "Symbolic?" Sarah's voice remained calm. But something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "Counselor, how long has your species been part of the council?" "The Altarians joined 800 years ago," Thane replied, puzzled by the apparent change of subject. "And how many council members have been absorbed by the hegemony during that time?" Thane's expression tightened. 17. 17 entire species erased from existence while the Council watched and called it inevitable. Sarah activated another holographic display. Here's what I find interesting about inevitability. The display showed military deployment patterns across hegemony space, vast fleets positioned along borders, garrison forces maintaining control over hundreds of worlds, and supply lines stretching across impossible distances. Your intelligence reports estimate hegemony military strength at roughly 40,000 capital ships with supporting fleets. Impressive numbers. Enough to maintain control over your vast territories and continue limited expansion. Sarah highlighted specific fleet positions. But here's the problem with inevitable expansion: logistics. The display zoomed in on human space. Unlike other territories, human worlds weren't arranged in neat, defensible clusters. They were scattered seemingly at random across dozens of light years, connected by shipping lanes that made no strategic sense to any military planner. Every world the hegemony takes requires permanent garrison forces to prevent rebellion, Sarah explained. Standard doctrine calls for at least 2 capital ships per system, plus supporting vessels. The math is simple. They can't absorb our territory without completely overextending their military capacity. Vexhi's mandibles spread in what looked like amusement. You assume your scattered colonies could mount meaningful resistance. Human military technology is primitive compared to hegemony standards. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed cheerfully. Our weapons are less advanced. Our ships are slower. Our defensive installations are inferior in every measurable way. The admission sent surprised whispers through the chamber. No council delegate had ever heard a human representative acknowledge technological inferiority so casually. But you're making the same mistake everyone makes when analyzing human capabilities, Sarah continued. You're thinking like a civilized species. She gestured, and the display changed again. This time it showed detailed casualty reports from every conflict involving human forces over the past 2 decades. The numbers were staggering, not because human losses were low, but because they were astronomically high. The Kepler colony massacre that started this negotiation, Sarah said quietly. 700,000 civilians killed in a single orbital bombardment. The hegemony expected surrender. Instead, the surviving colonists spent 6 months conducting guerrilla operations that cost the hegemony an entire siege fleet. The display showed battlefield recordings from Kepler. Human civilians with improvised weapons attacking vastly superior hegemony forces. Men and women charging into certain death to damage a single enemy vehicle. Children barely old enough to walk carrying explosives into enemy installations. My species doesn't fight wars the way you do, Sarah explained. We don't calculate acceptable losses or strategic value. We don't surrender when resistance becomes illogical. We fight until we're dead. All of us. Counselor Thane's face had gone pale. Ambassador, surely you don't mean every human world you abandon to the hegemony becomes a permanent military drain? Sarah interrupted. Not for months or years, for generations. Every human child born under hegemony rule will grow up planning rebellion. Every human adult will teach their children to hate their conquerors. We don't integrate, Counselor. We resist until extinction. The chamber fell silent except for the humming of environmental systems. Representatives stared at the human delegate with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. Overlord Vexhi finally spoke. You cannot seriously be threatening species suicide rather than accept reasonable terms. I'm not threatening anything, Sarah replied calmly. I'm explaining why the terms are unacceptable. The hegemony can conquer human space, but they cannot hold it. The cost of permanent occupation will eventually collapse their entire empire. The Council cannot permit such chaos, declared Representative Koloth, the massive crystalline being, speaking through harmonic resonances. Your resistance would destabilize the entire galactic political structure. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. Now you're beginning to understand our position. She activated a final holographic display showing economic data from across Council space. Trade routes, resource flows, and military expenditures created a complex web of interdependence. The Council has maintained stability for nearly 1,000 years through careful appeasement of the strongest powers, Sarah observed. Every time the hegemony demands territory, you negotiate minor concessions to avoid major conflicts. Every absorbed species represents a small sacrifice for continued peace. That is the foundation of civilized diplomacy, Counselor Thane protested. Compromise prevents galactic war. No, Sarah said quietly. Compromise delayed galactic war. But you've run out of species to sacrifice. After humanity, who's next? The Altarians? The Collective? How long before the hegemony's appetite requires the dissolution of the Council itself? The implications hung heavy in the recycled air. Every delegate understood the progression Sarah described. They had watched it happen repeatedly over centuries, always assuming their own species would somehow be spared. Vexhi's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation in Zephyrian physiology. The ambassador speaks of hypothetical futures. The present reality remains unchanged. Humanity lacks the military capacity to resist hegemony conquest. You keep saying that, Sarah mused. I wonder if you actually believe it, or if you're trying to convince yourself. She stood and moved to the center of the chamber, where the main holographic projectors could display her words throughout the entire station. Let me be completely clear about the human position, Sarah announced. We will not abandon our colonies. We will not accept hegemony sovereignty over any human world. We will not negotiate any agreement that grants legitimacy to conquest. Then you choose war, Vexhi declared. No, Overlord. You chose war the moment you decided human lives were expendable for your expansion plans. Sarah's voice carried absolute certainty. We're simply refusing to make it easy for you. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives argued in dozens of languages while translation systems struggled to keep pace. Some species called for immediate military intervention. Others demanded economic sanctions against both humans and the hegemony. A few began discussing emergency evacuation of their own border territories. Through the noise, Sarah remained standing in the center of the chamber. She wasn't shouting or gesturing. She simply waited for the chaos to subside, as if she had expected this exact reaction. When the noise finally died down, Counselor Thane spoke with desperate urgency. Ambassador Chen, please reconsider. The consequences of this decision extend far beyond humanity. Your refusal to negotiate puts every species in the galaxy at risk. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Yes, it does. For the first time in centuries, every species faces the same choice humans face: resist or be absorbed. No more hiding behind negotiations and appeasement. No more sacrificing smaller species to buy temporary safety. You would destroy galactic civilization to preserve human independence? Asked Representative Koloth. I would force galactic civilization to decide what it actually values, Sarah replied. If the only way to maintain your civilization is through the systematic elimination of smaller species, then your civilization deserves to fall. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Every representative understood the implications. The careful balance of power that had prevented major conflicts for nearly a millennium was about to collapse. Overlord Vexhi rose to his full, imposing height. The hegemony will not tolerate this disruption of galactic order. If humanity refuses reasonable negotiation, we will impose our own solution. I understand, Sarah said simply. When you do, remember that you were warned about the cost. She turned and walked toward the chamber exit. Her small human frame somehow commanding attention, despite being dwarfed by the alien architecture around her. Where are you going? Called Counselor Thane. The session isn't finished. Sarah paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembled representatives. Yes, it is. Humanity has made its position clear. We won't be returning to these negotiations. You cannot simply leave. The Council demands. The Council can demand whatever it wants, Sarah interrupted. But it has no authority over a species that refuses to recognize its legitimacy. With that, she walked out, leaving behind a chamber full of aliens staring at each other in stunned silence. For the first time in galactic history, a species had simply refused to participate in the system that had maintained order for centuries. The chaos was just beginning. Admiral Marcus Webb stood on the observation deck of the Earth Defense Station, watching the steady stream of civilian transports departing from Luna City. Each ship carried families fleeing to the outer colonies before the inevitable hegemony response. The sight reminded him of old documentaries about wartime evacuations from his species' violent past. Sir, we're receiving priority communications from 17 council members, reported Commander Lisa Park, her voice tight with stress. They're all demanding immediate meetings with human leadership. I'm sure they are, Webb replied without turning from the viewport. What's the status on the fleet repositioning? Third Fleet finished deploying to the Tau Ceti system 6 hours ago. Admiral Rodriguez reports all defensive positions are operational. Park hesitated. Sir, the Altarian delegation is particularly insistent. Councillor Thane claims they have a compromise proposal that could prevent armed conflict. Webb finally turned from the window. His weathered face showed the strain of 3 sleepless days since Ambassador Chen's dramatic exit from the council chambers. Commander, how long have humans been members of the Galactic Council? 43 years, sir. And in those 43 years, how many compromise proposals have we seen regarding hegemony expansion? Park consulted her tablet. According to diplomatic archives, approximately 78 separate proposals across various conflicts. How many of those compromises actually stopped hegemony expansion? Park's expression grew grim. None, sir. The territories in question were typically absorbed within 5 to 10 years of the compromise agreements. Exactly. Webb moved to the tactical display dominating one wall of the observation deck. The Council doesn't want to prevent conflict, Commander. They want to delay it until it becomes someone else's problem. The display showed real-time positions of military forces across human space. Unlike the neat formations favored by other species, human fleets were scattered in seemingly random patterns that made no sense according to standard tactical doctrine. The Altarian proposal involves what they call protected status for human colonies, Park continued. Hegemony administration but guaranteed cultural autonomy and self-governance. Webb's laugh was bitter. Cultural autonomy? Tell me, Commander, what happened to Corvani cultural autonomy under hegemony administration? The Corvani language was classified as inefficient for administrative purposes after 18 months. Cultural practices were gradually restricted as incompatible with social harmony. The last purely Corvani generation died approximately 40 years ago. And the Heshtar collective? Similar pattern. Administrative efficiency requirements eliminated traditional governance structures within 2 years. Collective identity was replaced with individual citizenship status. No distinct Heshtar cultural practices survived past the first generation. Webb nodded grimly. Protected status is just slower extinction. The Council knows this, but they keep pretending these compromise solutions actually mean something. A new voice interrupted from the doorway. Perhaps because the alternative is unthinkable. Both officers turned to see Ambassador Chen entering the observation deck. She looked exhausted but determined, her diplomatic composure somewhat frayed around the edges. Sarah, Webb greeted her. I thought you were still debriefing with intelligence. Finished an hour ago. They wanted to know every detail about hegemony reactions during the council session. Chen moved to join them at the tactical display. Overlord Vexhai was genuinely surprised by our refusal. The hegemony has been planning this absorption for over a decade. They never considered that we might simply say no. And now? Park asked. Now they're mobilizing everything. Chen activated a section of the display showing hegemony fleet movements. Long-range sensors show massive redeployment from 3 sectors. They're pulling garrison fleets from recently conquered territories. Webb studied the patterns. How massive? Preliminary estimates suggest they're committing nearly 60% of their total naval capacity to the human problem, Chen replied, which confirms something important about our strategic assessment. They can't afford a prolonged conflict, Webb realized. Pulling that many ships from garrison duty means they're betting on a quick resolution. Exactly. And if we can deny them that quick resolution, the entire hegemony power structure becomes unstable, Park finished. Conquered populations might see an opportunity for rebellion. Chen nodded. Intelligence reports indicate minor uprisings have already started in 3 former territories. Nothing major yet. But the hegemony is having to divert forces to deal with unrest they haven't faced in decades. Webb pulled up detailed analysis of human defensive preparations. The display showed weapons placements, supply caches, and civilian shelter networks across dozens of worlds. To any military strategist from another species, the arrangements looked chaotic and inefficient. The council species are terrified, Chen continued. Half of them think we're insane for provoking the hegemony. The other half are quietly asking if we actually have a chance of winning. And what did you tell them? The truth. We're not trying to win in any conventional sense. We're trying to make conquest so expensive that the hegemony collapses under the strain. Park highlighted population distributions across human territory. Current civilian evacuation stands at 43% completion. Most evacuees are families with young children, elderly, and non-essential personnel. What about the volunteers staying behind? Webb asked. Chen's expression grew somber. Surprisingly high numbers. When we announced that conquest was inevitable and asked for civilian evacuation, we expected maybe 20% to volunteer for resistance operations. Instead, we're getting nearly 60% in some colonies. The implications were staggering. Human colonies were essentially volunteering for suicide missions rather than accept hegemony rule. Sir, Park said quietly, I have to ask, are we making the right decision? The casualties will be enormous. We could be looking at the extinction of our entire species. Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical display. Commander, my grandfather fought in the last major human war before we joined the galactic community. He used to tell me stories about something called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Chen and Park listened as Webb continued. A small group of people facing impossible odds against an enemy with vastly superior resources. They knew they couldn't win. Everyone knew they would all die, but they fought anyway, because some things are more important than survival. What happened to them? Park asked. They all died, just as they expected, but their resistance inspired others. Small acts of defiance spread across an entire continent. Eventually, the superior enemy collapsed under the weight of fighting populations that refused to accept defeat. Chen activated another section of the display, showing communications traffic between council species. We're already seeing similar effects. The Altarians have quietly moved their border fleets to defensive positions. The collective has suspended all trade agreements with the hegemony. Even species that haven't directly supported us are reconsidering their relationship with hegemony expansion. They're realizing that appeasement has an expiration date, Webb observed. Eventually, every species becomes a target. A priority alert flashed on the communications panel. Park answered and listened for several moments before turning back to her superior officers. Priority message from Admiral Rodriguez at Tau Ceti, she reported. Long-range sensors have detected the leading edge of the hegemony response fleet. Estimated arrival time at the outer perimeter, 18 hours. The observation deck fell silent. For months, they had known this moment was coming, but the reality of imminent invasion still carried emotional weight that no amount of preparation could completely eliminate. Fleet composition? Webb asked. Park consulted the incoming data. Preliminary scans show at least 40 capital ships with full escort fleets. More ships arriving in the staging area every hour. Webb nodded grimly. Signal all defensive commands. Execute Protocol 7. As Park began transmitting orders, Chen moved closer to the viewport. The civilian transports were still departing, but their numbers were dwindling as evacuation neared completion. Sarah, Webb said quietly, you could still leave. The diplomatic shuttle is standing by. The outer colonies could use someone with your experience. Chen shook her head. My place is here. If we're making a statement about human principles, I need to be part of that statement. Even if it means certain death? Chen smiled sadly. Marcus, my grandmother survived the siege of Stalingrad during the old wars. She used to say that some battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about proving that some things can't be conquered. Webb understood. Every human carried stories from their species' violent past. Tales of impossible resistance, hopeless defiance, and people who chose death over submission. Those stories had shaped human culture in ways that other species found difficult to understand. What do you think will happen to the Council? Park asked, rejoining the conversation after completing her communications duties. Best case scenario, Chen replied. Our resistance inspires other species to coordinate their own defenses. The hegemony finds itself fighting on multiple fronts and eventually collapses from overextension. And worst case? The hegemony absorbs human territory after massive casualties, but they're so weakened that they can't maintain their existing empire. Everything collapses into chaos, but at least it's honest chaos, instead of this pretend civilization built on systematic extinction. Webb activated the general communication system, opening a channel to every human installation across their territory. His voice would reach colonies, military bases, civilian shelters, and resistance cells scattered across dozens of light years. This is Admiral Webb speaking to all human positions, he began. Long-range sensors confirm the approach of hegemony conquest fleets. All defensive protocols are now in effect. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Every person listening to this message understands what we face. The hegemony offers integration, which is just another word for cultural extinction. They promise peace, which is just another word for submission. Across human space, millions of people stopped what they were doing to listen to their military commander's final address. 43 years ago, humanity joined the Galactic Council, believing we could find our place in a peaceful, civilized galaxy. We discovered instead a galaxy ruled by fear, where survival depends on appeasing the strongest predator until it decides to consume you anyway. Webb's voice grew stronger, carrying absolute conviction. Today, humanity makes a different choice. We choose to fight for something worth preserving, even if we can't preserve it. We choose to resist something worth resisting, even if resistance is futile. He gestured toward the tactical display showing human defensive positions. Every world, every station, every ship in human space represents the same principle. Some things cannot be conquered as long as people exist to defend them. The transmission reached Admiral Rodriguez at Tau Ceti, where the first battles would begin. It reached civilians huddled in underground shelters on frontier worlds. It reached resistance fighters preparing ambush positions in asteroid belts and supply depots. The hegemony believes conquest is inevitable because they've never encountered a species willing to die for principles instead of survival, Webb continued. They're about to learn something important about human nature. On worlds throughout the galaxy, representatives of 46 species listened to the human admiral's words through intelligence intercepts and diplomatic channels. We don't fight because we can win. We fight because fighting is right. We don't resist because resistance is logical. We resist because submission is intolerable. Chen activated her own communication channel, adding her voice to the broadcast. To our allies and observers throughout the galaxy, remember what you see here. Remember that when tyranny appears inevitable, someone still has to choose to say no. The joint transmission concluded with Webb's final words. All human forces prepare for engagement. Make them pay for every inch. Make them regret every choice that brought them here. Show them what it costs to conquer a free people. As the communication ended, alarms began sounding throughout the Earth Defense Station. The Hegemony Response Fleet had accelerated their approach timeline. Estimated contact in 12 hours, Park reported. Webb and Chen stood together at the viewport, watching the last civilian transports disappear into hyperspace. Soon, only military personnel and volunteers would remain to face the coming storm. No regrets? Webb asked quietly. Chen considered the question seriously. About refusing the hegemony terms? None. About the cost? Every regret in the universe, but that doesn't change what we had to do. Webb nodded. Around them, the space station hummed with final preparations. Weapons systems activated, defensive fields powered up, and damage control teams moved to their stations. Across human space, similar preparations were reaching completion. 47 worlds prepared for siege. 300 million people made final choices about resistance or surrender. The chaos Ambassador Chen had predicted was about to begin. The first hegemony battleships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system like metal thunderclouds announcing a storm. Admiral Rodriguez watched from the bridge of the defense platform as 43 capital ships arranged themselves in precise formation, their escort fleets spreading into attack patterns that had conquered 100 worlds. "Sir, incoming transmission from the hegemony fleet," reported Lieutenant Kim Chen, no relation to the ambassador but sharing the same determined expression that seemed common among humans facing impossible odds. "Put it through," Rodriguez ordered. The main view screen flickered to life, showing Overlord Vex-High's imposing insectoid frame. The Zephyrian's mandibles spread in what passed for confidence among his species, but Rodriguez noticed the slight tremor that indicated stress. "Human military commander," Vex-High declared, "I am authorized to offer final terms for peaceful transition. Surrender all military assets and accept hegemony administration. Your civilian populations will be relocated to suitable territories with minimal disruption." Rodriguez stood slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Overlord Vex-High, I am Admiral Carlos Rodriguez, commanding officer of the Sol Defense Fleet. I have a counter-proposal." The alien's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. "You are hardly in a position to negotiate, Admiral. Leave our space immediately and never return. Consider this your only warning." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. When Vex-High responded, his synthetic voice carried genuine disbelief. "Admiral, your entire species controls perhaps 60 warships of antiquated design. My fleet alone represents more firepower than your entire military. Surely you cannot seriously expect—" "I expect you to make your choice, Overlord. Departure or conquest, but understand the price before you choose." Rodriguez gestured to his communications officer, who activated the fleet-wide transmission system. Across human space, every military installation received the same signal simultaneously. "All human forces, this is Admiral Rodriguez. The hegemony has rejected our warning. Execute final protocol. I repeat, execute final protocol." The response was immediate and shocking. On worlds throughout human territory, massive explosions began detonating. Industrial complexes, mining facilities, power generation plants, and resource extraction operations disappeared in brilliant flashes that were visible from orbit. Vex-High's image flickered as his ship's sensors registered the widespread destruction. What are you doing? Those are your own installations. Scorched Earth. Overlord, an old human military doctrine. If we can't have our worlds, then nobody can have our worlds. The tactical display on Rodriguez's bridge showed the systematic destruction continuing across dozens of systems. Every piece of infrastructure that made human worlds valuable to the hegemony was being eliminated by the inhabitants themselves. "You're destroying your own civilization," HFY said, his synthetic voice carrying a note of horror that transcended species barriers. "No, Overlord. We're denying you the prize you came to claim." Rodriguez activated another display showing economic projections. "Current estimates suggest it will take approximately 40 years to rebuild the infrastructure you're watching us destroy. 40 years of military occupation with no economic benefit to offset the costs." The implications were staggering. The hegemony's expansion model depended on conquered worlds quickly becoming economic assets that helped fund further conquest. Human resistance wasn't just military. It was economic warfare on a scale that threatened the foundation of hegemony power. "This is madness," HFY declared. "No rational species would choose extinction over integration." "You're right," Rodriguez agreed calmly. "No rational species would make that choice. But you've spent so long conquering rational species that you forgot something important. Humans aren't rational." On the view screen, HFY's mandibles spread in obvious agitation. Behind him, Rodriguez could see other hegemony officers examining tactical displays and reporting to their commander with increasing urgency. "Sir," Lieutenant Chen reported, "we're receiving priority transmissions from Admiral Webb at Earth and Admiral Park at the Centauri system. All defensive positions report ready for engagement." Rodriguez nodded. "Signal all commands. Weapons free. Show them what humans do when cornered." What followed defied every principle of civilized warfare known to galactic military doctrine. Instead of attempting to protect valuable installations or preserve infrastructure, human forces actively targeted their own industrial capacity while simultaneously engaging hegemony vessels. The first engagement at Tau Ceti lasted 17 minutes. The human defensive fleet was completely destroyed, but not before eliminating 2 hegemony capital ships and damaging 5 others. More importantly, the surviving hegemony forces found themselves in control of a system with no functioning infrastructure, no resource extraction capability, and no strategic value beyond the rubble of former human installations. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Galactic Council," Chen reported. "Priority 1 diplomatic channel." "Put it through." Counselor Thane's blue-scaled face appeared on a secondary display. The elderly Altarian looked haggard, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious desperation. "Admiral Rodriguez, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I implore you to cease this destruction immediately. Your actions are destabilizing the entire galactic economy. Trade routes are being disrupted, defensive alliances are crumbling, and 3 species have already withdrawn from Council membership." Rodriguez turned his attention to the counselor while keeping watch on hegemony fleet movements. "Counselor Thane, with respect, the galactic economy was built on a foundation of systematic conquest and extinction. If our resistance destabilizes that economy, perhaps it needed to be destabilized." "You don't understand the consequences," Thane pleaded. "The hegemony controls vital supply lines for 17 species. If their expansion model collapses, the resulting economic chaos could cause billions of deaths from resource shortages." "And how many billions have already died from hegemony integration over the past 3 centuries?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "How many species have been erased from existence to maintain this stable economy you're so concerned about preserving?" Thane's expression showed he understood the trap he'd walked into. The Council's peaceful stability had always depended on someone else paying the price. "Admiral," HFY interrupted, "your resistance is futile. My forces will take every human world regardless of your destruction. The only question is whether your population survived the conquest. You're welcome to try, Overlord. But remember, every world you take will require permanent garrison forces to prevent rebellion. Every human population you control will spend generations planning your destruction. And every day you maintain those occupations, other species will be calculating whether they're next on your list. The truth of Rodriguez's words was already visible in the tactical displays showing fleet movements throughout the galaxy. Species that had never openly opposed hegemony expansion were quietly repositioning their defensive forces. Trade agreements were being suspended. The careful balance of power that had maintained galactic stability was collapsing. "Sir," reported Commander Singh from the tactical station, "hegemony forces are beginning their assault on the outer defensive perimeter. Estimate 30 minutes until they reach our position." Rodriguez activated the ship-wide communication system. "All hands, this is the Admiral. In 30 minutes, we face the most powerful military force in known space. They have better ships, better weapons, and more resources than we could ever dream of possessing." He paused, letting his words reach every human on the platform and the surrounding defensive installations. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed that overwhelming force could substitute for understanding their enemy. They never bothered to learn what humans fight for when everything else is stripped away. The platform shuddered slightly as defensive weapons powered up to maximum output. "Today, we show the galaxy what it means to be human. We don't fight because we can win. We fight because some things are worth dying for. We don't resist because resistance is logical. We resist because freedom is more precious than survival." Across human space, similar declarations echoed from world to world as the final phase of human resistance began. On Earth, Admiral Webb watched hegemony forces approach the home system. On frontier worlds, civilian volunteers prepared for guerrilla operations that would continue for generations if necessary. "They want to absorb us into their empire," Rodriguez continued. "They want to erase our culture, our values, our very identity. They offer us existence in exchange for everything that makes existence worthwhile." The first hegemony missiles appeared on long-range sensors, still minutes away from impact. Every person listening to this broadcast understands what we face. We're outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched in every conventional measure of military power. But we have something the hegemony has never encountered: a species that chooses principle over survival. On the view screen, Vexhai watched with growing unease as his tactical officers reported the economic damage spreading across human territory. The cost of occupation was increasing exponentially with each passing hour. "Sir," Chen reported quietly, "multiple transmissions incoming from Galactic Council members. Emergency session requested. Several species are demanding immediate intervention to prevent further galactic destabilization." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Inform the Council that humanity will participate in any emergency session, but only as an equal member with full voting rights. No more negotiations about our survival." "They'll never accept those terms," Thane protested from the diplomatic channel. "Then they'll have to live with the consequences of our resistance," Rodriguez replied. "Because this is what happens when appeasement finally reaches its expiration date." The platform's defensive systems engaged as hegemony forces closed within weapons range. Energy beams and kinetic projectiles filled the space around Sol's outer defensive perimeter, creating a deadly light show that marked the beginning of humanity's last stand. But even as the first human installations came under fire, reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The Altarians had formally withdrawn from all hegemony trade agreements. The collective was mobilizing defensive fleets for the first time in centuries. 3 minor species had begun coordinating their military assets in an unprecedented alliance. "Sir," Singh reported between explosions, "hegemony forces are taking heavier casualties than projected. Their assault formations are designed for fighting conventional defensive strategies, not suicide attacks." Rodriguez nodded as he watched human ships ram hegemony vessels rather than attempt traditional combat maneuvers. It was horrifying and magnificent simultaneously, a display of human determination that defied every rational principle of warfare. "They're learning something important about human nature," Rodriguez observed. "We don't calculate acceptable losses the way other species do. Every human who dies fighting takes enemies with them." On the diplomatic channel, Counselor Thane watched the battle footage with obvious horror. "Admiral, please, this carnage serves no purpose. Your species will be extinct within days regardless of the casualties you inflict." "Counselor, you still don't understand what we're doing," Rodriguez replied as another human ship exploded, taking a hegemony cruiser with it. "We're not trying to win. We're trying to make conquest so expensive that no one will ever attempt it again." The realization dawned on Thane's face. "You're trying to change the fundamental nature of galactic politics." "We're trying to make genocide unprofitable," Rodriguez corrected. "For too long, the galaxy has accepted that might makes right, that superior technology justifies conquest, that weaker species exist only until stronger ones decide to eliminate them." A massive explosion rocked the defensive platform as hegemony bombardment intensified. Emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the bridge as damage control teams rushed to maintain critical systems. "But what if that assumption is wrong?" Rodriguez continued, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "What if conquest always carries a price that eventually becomes unbearable? What if resistance, even futile resistance, plants seeds that grow into problems conquerors can't solve?" On the main view screen, Vex High's image flickered as his flagship's communication systems struggled with interference from the ongoing battle. The Overlord's mandibles showed signs of extreme stress. "Admiral, my forces report anomalous resistance patterns. Your tactical deployments make no logical sense. Ships are engaging in obviously suicidal attacks with no strategic value." "Overlord, you're making the same mistake every conqueror makes," Rodriguez explained as he authorized the release of their final defensive measure, mines that would make the Sol system unusable for decades. "You assume your enemies think like you do." The mines detonated in sequence, creating a debris field that would prevent safe hyperspace navigation for years to come. The Sol system was effectively quarantined, useless to anyone who might try to claim it. You see tactical problems and calculate solutions. You analyze cost-benefit ratios and optimize resource allocation. But humans don't fight with calculators, Overlord. We fight with emotions you can't quantify. The final phase of the battle began as hegemony forces closed on the inner system. But their victory was increasingly hollow. They were conquering dead worlds, empty systems, and destroyed infrastructure that would require massive investment to rebuild. "Sir," Chen reported, "emergency transmission from Admiral Webb. Earth Defense Command reports successful completion of Protocol Zero." Rodriguez nodded solemnly. Protocol Zero was the ultimate scorched Earth option, the systematic destruction of Earth's entire technological infrastructure. If the hegemony wanted humanity's homeworld, they would inherit a pre-industrial wasteland that would take centuries to redevelop. "Signal Admiral Webb," Rodriguez ordered. "Tell him it's been an honor serving with him." As the transmission ended, Rodriguez turned back to the diplomatic channel where Counselor Thane waited with obvious anguish. "Counselor, I want you to remember what you've seen here. When other species face the choice between survival and surrender, remember that humans chose a third option." "What message does this send to future generations?" Thane asked desperately. "That violence is preferable to negotiation? That destruction is better than compromise?" "The message we send," Rodriguez replied, as the platform's final defenses failed around him, "is that some things cannot be conquered, that free will has a price that no amount of superior firepower can overcome, that the cost of tyranny can always be made higher than tyrants are willing to pay." The defensive platform shuddered under final bombardment as hull breaches spread across multiple sections. Around Rodriguez, his crew remained at their stations, continuing to coordinate resistance even as their ship died around them. "All human forces," Rodriguez broadcast on his final transmission, "you have served with honor. You have shown the galaxy what humans do when everything else is stripped away. Remember, we fight not because we can win, but because fighting is right." The transmission cut as the platform's power grid finally failed. But across human space, the message had been received and understood. Every remaining human installation continued the same pattern: resist until destruction, deny the enemy any prize worth claiming. On worlds throughout the galaxy, other species watched the systematic elimination of humanity with growing unease. The hegemony was winning, but their victory looked increasingly like defeat. They were conquering empty systems, absorbing worthless territory, and discovering that dead worlds offered no economic benefit to offset the enormous military costs of maintaining occupation. Within days, the first hegemony-controlled worlds began experiencing their own problems. Populations that had accepted conquest for centuries suddenly began asking uncomfortable questions about their own situations. If humans could choose death over submission, what did that say about species that had chosen submission over resistance? Ambassador Chen's prediction proved accurate. Chaos had indeed erupted throughout galactic civilization. But it wasn't the destructive chaos of random violence. It was the productive chaos of populations finally questioning the fundamental assumptions that had governed their lives for centuries. The Galactic Council never recovered from humanity's refusal to negotiate. Within a year, 17 species had withdrawn from membership, demanding fundamental reforms to the system that had enabled systematic conquest for so long. The hegemony discovered that ruling empty worlds was indeed economically unsustainable. The cost of maintaining garrison forces across territory that produced no revenue eventually forced them to abandon their expansion model entirely. And scattered throughout the galaxy, in refugee camps and hidden settlements, human survivors continued teaching their children the lesson that had changed everything: that some principles are worth dying for, and that the willingness to pay that price can reshape the universe itself. Humanity had lost everything: their worlds, their civilization, their future as a unified species. But in losing, they had won something far more valuable. They had proven that conquest has limits, that tyranny has costs, and that the human spirit, once awakened, could inspire changes that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The chaos they created wasn't destruction. It was revolution,